Claire, thank you very much indeed for that introduction and for the invitation to come to talk to you this evening. It's always a pleasure to be here to support the work of Aware in some small way. I'm full of admiration for the wonderful work that Aware does. I work predominantly with older adults. I'm a consultant psychiatrist here in this hospital, and I work with people aged 65 and older. And I wanted to share with you some of my thoughts about, I suppose, issues relevant to the emotional well-being of older adults. Now, I'm not going to get clinical, I'm not going to get pathological, we're not going to talk about conditions specifically. I want to take a more macro view as to how we perceive being old, becoming old. So, how we perceive old age and the essential needs of older people, that's something hopefully we'll talk about and flesh out in some detail. We want to talk about the inevitable adjustments of later life, and there are many. I do want to bang a drum about practical tips about surviving and thriving in later years. It is possible to thrive in later years because there are opportunities and freedoms that go with being old. Let's be ambitious. What you'll gain from this evening, maybe some new ideas to help older people overcome depression and negative thinking that you can pass on to people. Confidence, certainly, to challenge the negative stereotypes in modern society about older people. I do want to flesh that out in detail because it does really impact hugely on how we view our own ageing process. I want to give you some insight into how to reactivate the inner resources of older people to help them embrace the challenges of ageing, and possibly ways to examine and look at our own fears of ageing, which we studiously avoid sometimes. We live in denial about this whole area, and I want to just shake that up a little bit this evening. So what have people thought about growing old? Well, let's look at some quotes from some historical figures, some figures in literature. Plato talked about the spiritual eye improving as the physical eyesight declines. So there is the opportunity maybe with the aging process to gain some wisdom. Oscar Wilde is slightly tongue-in-cheek. The tragedy of old age is not that one is old, but that one is young. That you're still the same person. You know, the person looking out at you from the mirror may have grey hair, a few wrinkles here and there, but within yourself, you are still very much the same person, the same personality, same hopes, dreams, ambitions and aspirations. Tom Stoppard, equally tongue-in-cheek, age is too high a price to pay for maturity. And a little bit of the more bleaker views of later life that are commonly expressed in literature. Jean-Paul Richter, what makes old age so sad is not that our joys, but that our hopes cease. And it gets even worse. Look at this. Old age is a second childishness, and mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. And that's a quote from Shakespeare, as you like it. So pretty bleak stuff. I think you'll agree. No dispute there. Are there ever any compensations in the face of all of these losses and decline and deterioration? Well, look at this quote from George Santayana. Never have I enjoyed youth so thoroughly as I have in my old age. I have drunk the pleasures of life more pure, more joyful than it ever was when mingled with all the hidden anxieties and little annoyances of actual living. Nothing is inherently and invincibly young except spirit, and spirit can enter a human being perhaps better in the quiet of old age and dwell there more undisturbed than in the turmoil of adventure. So a slight paradox here, that actually we can really, truly become alive when we get through the turmoil of youth phase, and we can really appreciate what's important. Now, growing old is catching on, which is hardly surprising given the alternative, let's face it. About 10% of the world's population is over 65. And just to look at some raw data, in 1950 the older population globally was about 200 million people. 200 million older adults were on the planet in around 1950. Due to increased life expectancy and falling birth rates, this is going to rise exponentially. It looks set to rise to 1.2 billion by 2025. Now, there are a number of factors behind this, and the factors behind increased life expectancy, as you know, it's not all about health, it's not all about treatments, it's all about basic things like sanitation, it's all about vaccination. Simple health prevention measures can make a difference to life expectancy. But also we are having fewer babies being born. Now, Ireland is very much an exception. As you know, Ireland's birth rate is quite robust, it's quite high. Other Western European countries have been declining in their population for years. I'm thinking of Italy, I'm thinking of Germany, I'm thinking of countries like Japan even. So Ireland is bucking the trend. But the rise in older people is happening globally. Countries in Latin America have seen large rises in the numbers of older people. In China, the Asian subcontinent, and urban centres in Africa. And it's not just cities like Johannesburg or Cape Town. I'm also talking about cities like Nairobi, Lagos, Abuja, and so on. So more and more of us are living longer. When does old age start? I suppose the separation between older adults and younger adults is very arbitrary, and we often take it to be 65, and it's often chosen for administrative reasons, for example, service provision. Otto von Bismarck, when he introduced the first pension in Germany in the 1880s, decided that you should only receive the pension when you reached the grand old biblical age of 70. Now, he did really hope that very few people would claim it, and in fact, at that stage, very few people did claim it. In health services, 65 years of age is frequently used as a cut-off point. And I want to make this point. If you can take one point home with you tonight, let it be this. There are vast differences between people at different ages. People closer to 65 may be more psychologically and biologically middle-aged, whereas those aged 80 plus may have very different needs. So, older people are not a single homogeneous group. We cannot tar them with the same brush and make sweeping statements and generalizations about older people as a group, because they do not really exist as a single homogeneous group. Age, after all, is only a number, a cipher for the records. A man can't retire his experience, he must use it. Experience achieves more with less energy and time. I'm thinking of Monsignor James Horan, for example, the man whose statue was erected at Knock Airport last weekend. And he talked about being an old man in a hurry with his project to build this airport on the side of a bog. And it's certainly a wonderful innovation, incredible vision for someone who had no expertise in that area whatsoever. But he talked about being this old man in a hurry, achieving more with less energy and time. That's a quote from Bernard Baruch. Okay, I want to look at stereotypes and talk a little bit about how we stereotypically view older people. Stereotypes are important. It's basically about pattern matching, I suppose, our ability to make sense of things in the environment and to compare and contrast. And they do play a central role in social life and communication. They proceed and shape our perceptions. But the problem is stereotypes don't do justice to individuals. They only refer to observable appearance and behaviour. And where older people is concerned, that may refer to the grey hairs, the very externals, rather than looking any deeper than skin level. Stereotypes invariably negative, only occasionally positive. When I worked in England, some people used to say to me, "How come, Doc, you don't like being called Paddy?" They just couldn't appreciate that actually this was a kind of a racial stereotype that was being peddled. And by and large, they are negative. They're only occasionally positive. But we will look at some positive stereotypes applied to older people in a moment. If you have these positive stereotypes, they're very fickle. They can flip into negative stereotypes if an illusion of perfection is shattered by illness, for example. So let's look at them. The stereotypes that may apply to older people would include the despondent stereotype. Although all older people are sad, lonely, and neglected. Or the severely impaired stereotype that all older people are senile or incoherent or slow thinking or vulnerable, afraid, victimized, worried, terrified to go outside their own front doors in case they're going to be mugged. Or older people are complaining, they're selfish and they're prejudiced. Or older people are mildly tired or fragile or dependent. Or reclusive, timid and naive and living in the past. So pretty negative stuff, isn't it? Very negative. What about the positive stereotypes? Older people can be characterized in this way on occasion, often through the media. The media loves these type of positive stereotypes, and they surface from time to time behind the headlines. The stereotype of the golden ager, someone who's active, independent, and fun-loving. Or the perfect grandparent, someone who's wise and grateful and trustworthy. Or the John Wayne conservative, someone who wears the regimental tie, the blue blazer, who embodies the kind of national characteristics. Or the silver surfer, someone who's up to date with the latest technology, someone who's with it. And we come across this many, many times. And in fact, the biggest users uptake of people who uptook the internet when it first came out in the mid-1990s were older retirees in the States as part of an active retirement activity. So there's a grain of truth in it. But stereotypes are damaging to older people. Why? Because they internalise them, they add to fear and isolation, and they build barriers between the young and between the old. They do not convey the truth. They convey a lot of misunderstanding, unfortunately. And talking to the old, because of these barriers that can be erected between the generations, can be perceived as a time-consuming duty and a necessary therapy, rather than something that develops the different generations. Where does it all come from? What are the roots of stereotypes? I want to look at that now. I suppose this quote from Sarah Kent is relevant. The belief that youth will fade and beauty is fleeting is rooted in the symbolic equation between youth, beauty, and goodness in Western culture. And as we'll see, this is very much a Western culture-bound phenomenon. There's no doubt that the body does reveal evidence of the ineradicable march of time. You can take yourself off to a plastic surgeon. You can take yourself off to any amount of therapists to reverse the superficials of the aging process, and you will succeed for a while, but eventually it does catch up and people guess your age. But there's even a widespread assumption that the bodies of elderly men and women can be painful to look at. Why? Because they remind us of our own mortality. Do you ever have older models, for example, selling anti-wrinkle creams? Who are the models that they use? They use very young women. Okay? An image of an aging body can evoke pity, curiosity, repulsion, and disgust, the strongest, most visceral negative emotion that human beings can express, and even humour. There's no doubt that time is a great healer, but a lousy beautician. Women, unfortunately, sorry to say this, may be especially prone to loss of status, and feminists have long complained that too much female power is based on physical beauty rather than experience, wealth, and occupation, which male power is based upon. I suppose if you're boiling it down to the most commonly peddled stereotype of older people that's out there, it's about the senility stereotype. This image of older people as being dribbling, incontinent, lacking physical coordination, and being unable to communicate coherently. Positive stereotypes, on the other hand, create this idealized elder person who proves that age is all in the mind by a triumph of will over physiology. And again, the media loves these stories. For example, people doing a parachute jump at the age of 80. My God, I think you'd be a very brave person to do that if you land on your hip and get a hip fracture. Not to be undertaken lightly. There are other examples, someone undertaking a university degree at the age of 85, or someone robbing a bank, who's a pensioner, or someone stopping a bank robber who's a pensioner. And you also see the outrageous stereotype from time to time, and I suppose this is an extension of the positive stereotype, stressing rebellion and non-conformity. I don't know if any of you heard of the famous poem by Jenny Joseph called Warning. It's very well worth looking up on the internet. She talks about the frivolity of her excesses as she goes through her later years. She learns to spit, to run a stick along a railing, spending all her money on brandy and summer gloves, and really this is an example of kind of the outrageous stereotype. The problem is that stereotypes in general provide an opt-out from responsibility. They're fundamentally ageist, and humour, stereotyping, and ageism basically allow us to deny the reality of our own ageing process. And again, I'll say again, a large part of negative stereotyping in Western society is based on a fear of the cosmetic aspects of ageing. What is wrong with a wrinkle or two, for goodness sake? A negative portrayal of older people is actually increasing in the media, and Miller, in a survey in 1999, looked at changes in how older people were portrayed in advertising between the mid-1950s and the late 1990s, and he found that the number of negative ads portraying older people increased by threefold in those 4 or 5 decades. So that's a significant increase. But not all cultures are so cosmetically preoccupied. When wrinkles appear on a Chinese grandmother's face, they're often treated with great joy by her granddaughter as a sign of higher status. What a wonderful reframe on a wrinkle. It's a badge of higher status. Okay, the wider picture. Was it always like this? How do other cultures treat older people? Do older people get a better deal in non-Western societies, for example? Was there ever an historic golden era for older people through human history when we lived most of our lives eking out an agrarian existence, farming the land and so on? What was the status of older people in the past? What was the status of older people in pre-industrial societies? We are still very much in the 21st century living with the hangover of the Industrial Revolution. That has been the defining period, if you like, that we are very much living with. You could say we're a post-industrial society. Well, what was life like for older people before the Industrial Revolution? Amos and Harold, two anthropologists who researched this and have written about it, basically felt that the fate of elders depended on the balance of the cost and contribution that older people made. In other words, if they were still able to contribute, they did okay, they were respected, they managed to have a fair share of resources, but if they didn't, they often could be excluded. The degree of control older people have on resources is really important. Don't give up, your house too soon. Don't sign away your land to your kids. Basically, that's the moral of the story. But interestingly, men fare worse than women, as a rule, as women are still able to contribute. Can anyone guess why that might be? It's actually through the role of grandparenthood. So women still very much have that active role and had that active role in pre-industrial societies, whereas the hunter-gatherer existence did depend on strength, virility, health, energy, and so on, and that's something that older men did lose quite rapidly. But older people in the past still exerted leadership if societies valued wisdom and supernatural powers. If, for example, older people were felt to be a repository of healing wisdom, or if they knew where the location of water holes were. But this idea of the golden era of an extended family all living under the same roof is a bit of a myth. And census records have been looked at right back as far as Elizabethan Britain, for example, and in fact nuclear households, families just living together, parents and kids, were much more the norm. And this idea of multiple generations living under the same roof never really happened. So I would say to you that there probably never was a golden historic era for older people. Okay, if we take stereotyping to its logical conclusion, we get into ageist practice in relation to older people and ageist thinking. And the roots of ageism in Western society are basically a fear of death and dying and an association with old age. As we say, the Western culture of youth and beauty, and the emphasis on productivity, as we've seen. In other words, if you're still able to produce, if you're still able to contribute to society, you have status, you have value. But if you don't, that is a major problem. And ageism, which is basically, I suppose, a very negative way of treating older people, it's basically discrimination against older people simply because of their chronological age, has a powerful influence on how we view older people, but also on how they view themselves, because older people are members of society. It may have two forms. It's predominantly due to youth-oriented social preferences, and the first form, the disabling compassion form, is something that in the health services we unfortunately inflict on older people all the time. We don't mean to, but with the best of intentions, we take over the meal times of older people, we look after them, we help them in the shower, nursing staff are there to help people, and this may be very, very undermining, it may be very de-skilling of older people. So we have to be very aware of stripping away independence of older people when they come into hospital, for example. So the concern may be genuine, but it's patronising and it underestimates the abilities of older people. Or the other form would be neglect, where the needs of older people are just simply discounted. I remember working as a junior doctor in the Meath Hospital and being told by my consultants at the time not to give clot-busting drug to anyone over 65 when they presented with a heart attack. Okay, so a very, very naked view of older people, discrimination that was clearly stated, that we weren't even bothered thrombolizing people when they presented to A&E with a heart attack. Similar examples would be denying older people access to specialist care or access to procedures like kidney dialysis and so on, simply because of their chronological age. So again, unfortunately, examples of ageism within the health service are rife. Ageism reduces social status and roles. It basically undermines self-esteem and denies older people a fair share of resources, as we've talked about. It creates and fosters prejudice about the nature and experience of old age too. And these negative images and myths may become internalized by older people, reducing their expectations of themselves. Okay? Reverse ageism. This is interesting. So this is basically a contemptuous dismissal of younger generations by older people. And you often hear this, that older people may say, oh, the young now are immoral, or they're lazy, or they're non-productive. This is quite common. We hear this. And you can understand this, I suppose, as a kind of a defensive reaction and an attempt to diminish the threat of the persecuting young. But interestingly, reverse ageism can also be directed by older people towards their peers. Let me show you this quote. The elders consider themselves the fortunate exceptions to society's negative views of older people. While they think of themselves as vigorous, productive and useful to society, they imagine most of their peers to be in bad shape, useless and boring. And I can attest to many examples of this in my work, when I may suggest politely to an older patient to maybe think of joining an active retirement group or a day centre, and they say, come on doc, why on earth would I want to be going there and mixing with other older people? You know, they immediately split off themselves from that category. So I want to really convince you this evening that ageism is based on a series of myths. So let's shatter some of those myths. The myth of chronology, that all older people are a homogenous group by virtue of their age. Hopefully I've convinced you that older people are more diverse than any other age group in society. Or the myth of ill health, that illness in old age is normal, that it's normal to be sick, inevitable and untreatable. The myth of mental deterioration, that everyone who is old will suffer dementia or does suffer dementia. Or the myth of the inflexible personality, that older people are inflexible, intolerant, inherently conservative, that literally the broadness of mind and the narrowness of waist change places. Or the myth of misery, that all older people are unhappy simply because they are old. Or the myth of rejection and isolation, that society rejects older people who subsequently and obediently and passively withdraw and disengage from life. And some sociologists actually put this forward as a very valid theory of how older people should adapt to later life, that they should disengage and withdraw. And nothing could be more toxic or undermining for older people, I believe. Or the myth of dependence, that all older people are a burden on society, they're a drain on resources. And this is looming again as people talk about a pensions crisis, the ticking demographic time bomb, and so on. Other things to consider. Many aspects of old age are simply not intrinsic to growing old. They are associated within our current social context. There are vast differences, I repeat again, between older people in respect of the age ranges involved. There's huge variability in late adulthood. Older people are no more alike than younger people. And it's interesting about life expectancy. Actually, life expectancy increases as we get older and is increasing generally. And the good news is that you can take away a decade, a gift for everyone in the audience this evening. Take 10 years off your chronological age. So 70 is the new 60, and so on. And there is evidence for this. The average life expectancy now is approximately 82 years of age in Ireland, okay, for women. And if you get to that age, you can expect to live until 90. So it does increase, actually, as you age. Health. The majority of older adults perceive their health as good, and this is very much contrary to what the stereotypical views will lead us to believe. Even if you do surveys of adults into their mid-80s, the vast majority of older adults will rate their health as good, despite the presence maybe of arthritis or one or two medical problems. And health certainly is the biggest single predictor of quality of life. In terms of longevity, physical exercise is the most important health habit linked to longevity, but also to cognitive performance. And there is a big drive on now to prevent dementia, for example, by turning to your vascular risk factors, losing weight from middle age onwards. Physical changes, no physical change is inevitable in later life. Not everyone gets grey hair. We all know people that don't, for example. Not everyone gets dementia, not everyone gets arthritis. But there are common changes that we do sometimes see. For example, loss of some brain neurons, maybe decreased hearing ability, and so on. In terms of depression, older people actually may be less prone to anxiety as they get older. They are less impulsive. Certainly mild or moderate depression does appear to rise in frequency after the age of 70 or 75, but serious clinical depression is not more common in old age, and most community surveys and hospital-based surveys have shown that. And ethnic groups vary in their rates of depression. Okay, how can we challenge ageism? I think, and hopefully you will agree, that this is the right and worthy thing to do. I think we have to do much more than just legislation in terms of looking for equality for older people. We've got to actually attack it at its core through education. We've got to ensure that the media reports the activities of older people fairly and effectively in a balanced way, neither pandering to either end of the stereotypes, either negative or positive. I think there is some onus on older people themselves to demonstrate productivity and enthusiasm, that wonderful attribute that we really need to get the most out of life. We need to fight and challenge blatant examples of ageism. For example, insurance restrictions. If you go to America with a pre-existing medical condition and fall ill, what is your fate? It could be a very expensive bill. Or compulsory redundancy. I mean, my mother was dismissed from her job when she got married. You know, how ridiculous do we think that is now? And yet people are automatically dismissed and forced to retire from the workplace when they reach the age of 65. Will we think that ridiculous in 2 decades or 3 decades. And age discrimination in the workplace and age awareness and self-consciousness is rife. If people of middle age lose their job, they feel hugely disadvantaged when they come to the interview process. And many cosmetic surgeons will tell you that they are helping people with procedures and Botox injections and so on to look young in advance of interviews. So that is quite sad. Collective power does come through the ballot box, and certainly we saw in 2008 when there was the move by the government at the time to take away the medical cards or restrict them, we did see a mass mobilisation in this country, arguably maybe for the first time, against that move, and they managed to dilute that initiative to some extent. And older people, the grey vote as it's called in the States, older people are far more likely to vote than younger people. So politicians beware. You take away the bus pass at your peril, you will get hordes of older people, rightly so, out onto the street. Taking away something like that would be appalling in terms of the mental health and well-being of older people. Let's celebrate some role models. Michelangelo worked on St. Peter's Basilica until he was 89. Monet started painting his large series of water lilies canvases at 76. Frank Lloyd Wright designed the Guggenheim Museum in New York. I don't know if you've ever seen it, a very futuristic building, at the age of 90. Pierre Monteux was invited to become the London Symphony Orchestra's principal conductor at 86, but only accepted when he was given a 25-year contract. Now there's optimism for you. Mary Wesley had her first novel published at 70. Nelson Mandela began his political career in his 70s. And look at the wisdom, all the attributes he brought to his role. He was able to transform South Africa relatively peacefully and is still a central figure in that country's stability. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Britain at 68, again at 78, and remained an MP until he was 90, and then went off to do a new career, which was a journalist and writer. Could anyone else have stood up to fascism? All Winston Churchill's cabinet were encouraging him to make a deal with Hitler, let Hitler have France, and he said no, he wouldn't. So would a younger leader perhaps have caved in? Who knows? The course of history might have been very different. So the demise of an ism. Let's look at some of the stages, whether it be racism, whether it be sexism. How do we defeat an ism? These are the various stages. The denial stage, where there's unidentified but very clear-cut oppression. There's identification, adorning awareness of the rights of a particular group in society that have been deprived up to now. The reaction stage, where there's political campaigning, where there's equality legislation put in place, and then pluralism, where the prejudice fades. Where would you say we're at in terms of ageism? Well, I would say we're probably between denial and identification. Okay, we're probably no further and have been no further for quite some time. There was a famous judge in the States, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in the US Supreme Court, who said that people cannot be subject to ageism because everyone becomes old. Not everyone is gay or black, but everyone will age. And that's how kind of behind prominent lawmakers are in terms of their views of this issue. So there are a number of ways of viewing age I want to talk to you about. There's the chronological age, which we're all aware of. It's on our birth cert. Age is a descriptive category. Age which is imputed from a relationship. You can be someone's parent or grandparent and so on. In terms of visible bodily changes, as we've seen, as a set of social expectations, the roles that we fulfill or opt out of. Or age is a biography, which is probably a much better way to appreciate someone's true personal history and worth. What are the dimensions of ageing? It involves certainly a variety of processes, the biological changes, the psychological, but also the social. And those three, I think, are very much intertwined. You can't separate them out. What have psychologists thought of mental processes in old age? Well, they didn't get off to a very good start because of Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud came out with the statement, above or near the age of 50, the elasticity of the mental processes is lacking. Older people are no longer educable. Quote, unquote, Sigmund Freud. Now, he did have the good grace to retract that statement before he died in his early 80s, but it was a terrible statement. And I think it put off a lot of interest among psychologists in the stages of later life. Until the mid-1980s, the Institute of Psychoanalysis rejected potential trainees over the age of 40. Carl Jung did talk about mental activity. He talked about the changes throughout the lifespan, the possibility of gaining wisdom from acceptance in later life. Elliot Jakes coined the term midlife crisis. He had to use it, talk about midlife rather than late life in 1965. And Peck talked about the 3 stages of psychological adjustment needed in later life. But it was Erikson who has really contributed most to our understanding of, I suppose, human development and the various stages in that. And through the 7 Ages of Man classification, as you know, Erikson divided the life cycle into 7 different stages. And in terms of those stages, he talked about the need to resolve a conflict and a challenge, and if that could be resolved, you could move through that stage successfully and move on to the next challenge. And Erikson emphasised reciprocity across the life course, and basically that old and young are interdependent. They need each other if they are to flourish. He felt that older people needed to feel their life had been worthwhile to achieve a sense of integrity. But an inability to achieve a sense of self-integrity may lead to a marked fear of death and desperation or despair. So integrity versus despair was this stage, the final stage in Erikson's developmental cycle. So Erikson argued that how you handled earlier life transitions or crises was central to predicting the outcome of integrity versus despair. If you got through earlier stages and challenges in your human development, managed to form a relationship, managed to get a job, managed to cope with middle age, and all the kind of existential questions that are thrown at us through our pathway of development and growth in life, that if you successfully navigated those earlier stages, you would successfully overcome this challenge, this crisis of integrity versus despair. He thought that older people had an example to set, okay? Healthy children will not fear life if their elders have integrity enough not to fear death. And Erikson felt that in a wider context, actually, this had a much more important resonance. He felt that how generations handled and managed crises would affect future generations. How to achieve integrity? I suppose it's easier said than done. I suppose the challenge is to accept that spiritually, when it comes to the end of our lives, that death is part of life and we should prepare for it. That healing is not necessarily physical. There are spiritual dimensions to healing as well that are very, very important. I suppose a common ethical standpoint and moral standpoint is compassion and giving to receive. That's something that's a universal truism, I think, across a lot of cultures. Being content with what you have is very important. Peace can follow. Love and affection, if you have that mindset, can certainly breed happiness and longevity, and living holistically and in moderation without excesses. We do shed the excesses of later life, and that can help us achieve integrity. So that's really how we achieve integrity. Sounds like a bit of hard work, doesn't it? Okay, adaptation. I would argue that older people are highly adaptive, very, very adaptive. And when we think about the attributes of adaptation, we think about flexibility, often we think about younger people, but I would argue that older people have so much to adapt to, whether it be loss of friends, bereavement, roles, and so on. Old age is about adapting to changing circumstances, and the success or otherwise of that adaptation makes the experience of later life positive or negative. It's highly individual. For example, retirement, which we're going to talk about now. This can be eagerly anticipated. People can dream about the retirement years before they actually retire, they leave the workplace, or it can be dreaded. It's very, very individual. Linking past and current lifestyles is crucial. Now, it can be very easy for people who work in certain professions. For example, GPs, although they may lose their medical card list at the age of 65, they have to give that up. They can remain in private practice, for example, for many years. There is no restriction. I've had a couple of patients who've been GPs in their early 80s. Judges can stay on the bench for a long period of time. Professors can gain the title of emeritus professor. You can even be Pope Emeritus, as we've seen this year. So linking past and current lifestyles is crucial. Keeping the hand in with your core skills and talents, I think, is crucial. Health issues can certainly interrupt work or long-standing routines, and health setbacks can lead to loss of meaning and depression and the kind of plans that you had in retirement. Losses such as bereavement may force people to take on new roles. Losses in terms of health or functional ability due to arthritis or limitation of movement for whatever reason may impair your ability to do certain tasks. For example, driving, gardening, DIY. Do older people give them up willingly. By and large, they do if they can no longer be conducted to an acceptable standard. They may recruit help. The first person that most older people recruit help with is the garden, in my experience. Shrinkage of life space. Older people have seen and are adapting to enormous societal changes. We have seen, head over heel turns in society, in our institutions, and trust in our institutions over the last number of decades that couldn't have been envisaged or imagined. The loss of trust in institutions like the church, professions, and so on has been phenomenal. And these are big changes for older people to adjust to. And by and large, they do it pretty well. Now, I'm conscious that a lot of people in the audience may be around retirement age, so I did want to spend some time talking a little bit about retirement. I think it's a very important transition to make in life to negotiate. Retirement has certainly become a mass experience in modern industrial societies in most Western economies. In Britain, for example, just to give you some statistics, 73% of men over 65 still worked. By 1951, that had fallen to 31% over 65, and by 1991 was below 10% over 65 of men still worked. So it's a major personal milestone, a universal personal milestone. It can be perceived as a threat or a loss or opportunity. It can be the start of a new chapter in life, heralding a long personal journey or a search for a new identity. It can be a wonderful time. The experience of retirement, how is it likely to flesh out? I suppose it is down to two things, health and wealth, unfortunately. Financial provision is pretty important. You don't have to be a millionaire, but I think to have certainly, to be meeting your ends, I think is very, very important, and paying the bills. And certainly health is a major, major predictor of well-being and life satisfaction in later years. Poor health. If you experience poor health running up to retirement, you may have to leave the workplace early, and that lowers the average retirement age by 1 to 3 years. Now, retirement was felt to be a very, very significant event in the past. Let me give you a quote from Joseph Stiglitz in 1949. Abrupt and obligatory retirement, even if anticipated and accepted intellectually, almost invariably inducts severe emotional distress. Its consequences are often drastic. There's an old saying among clinicians that to order the retirement of a businessman is tantamount to signing his death certificate within the year. Okay? And that used to be something that GPs would often say. And Gumpert, in his quote, talks about idleness as the greatest enemy of the ages and presents them with a ticket to death. So there was this feeling that actually retirement may not be terribly good for you. Now, recent research has really questioned this, and health really doesn't change for better or for worse following retirement. It's interesting that retirement now is undergoing a bit of a transformation, particularly for the baby boomer generation, people born after 1945. Their identity is less shaped by work now than before, more by leisure interests, more by finances, more by social network, and so on. Whether we're seeing a reverse of that with the recession, I don't know. I think people of working age are working longer and longer hours, and the feeling is that we are taking on a work role as our sole identity, which is not a good thing. But premature retirement certainly can be associated with high levels of distress and hardship and a kind of an ambiguous social position. The people that I think fare worst with premature retirement would be middle-aged males. In my experience, if a man gets depression, having retired, it can be very, very challenging to treat that person. It could take years to emerge from that scenario. Female retirement often felt easier to cope with, and often women are maybe more adaptive and adjust better, provided there isn't a sense of financial pressure. But again, I would say to you that maintaining continuity with your work role is really important if you can. Some jobs may not allow for that. They demand an absolute cut-off. You're seen as a weirdo if you kind of go in every month and socialise with your work colleagues. There is that abrupt cut-off, and that's not easy. But compared to unemployment, I think retirement is generally devoid of stigma. Okay, I want to just share with you the work of a lady called Janet Butwell, who wrote a book called Enjoy Retirement, and she has some top tips for loving life after work. And I think they're very good, and I wanted to share some of them with you. Basically, she's encouraging people to take time out to write about the things you love. The best therapist can be a paper and pen, a journal, to brainstorm ideas about your goals, aspirations, ambitions, and hopes for the future. Dare to do something different. We can all get into a very fixed routine when we retire. Actually, that can be partly a good thing, but partly a bad thing. We do need change and challenge to motivate us as well. You can retire to work. I remember our first security guard here in St. Pat's, and he allowed me interview him and video him, and he's allowed me talk about his example. He worked as a senior accountant and came to work as a part-time security guard, and the job that he had here was really, really meaningful to him. And there are benefits of flexible part-time working. Create personal space and time for you and your partner. When the man retires, often, typically, it's the man that retires, he invades the space, the domestic territory that was the sole preserve of the wife, and that can cause tension. So although a fundamental emotional need is to be together and exchange attention, we do need a bit of privacy as well. Try living on your pension now. I warn you again, the biggest predictor of retirement can be around finances. And a lot of older patients are telling to me how worried they are, for example, about the recent property tax. So you've got a budget. And you will face a huge salary cut on your retirement. If you're going to exist on the state pension, people's salary can drop by 70%. So it can be a really interesting exercise 6 months before you retire to try living on your pension income. Do something you really enjoy. Be fun and spontaneous. If it's going for a walk in the autumn, kick the leaves along the way. Try and give it your full attention. Try really and engage your attention mechanism in terms of what you're doing. Keep up appearances. I think it's very important to nurture your fundamentals, your appearances in terms of your physical grooming and so on. That sends out a very important message to people. Try booking holidays with the difference. Thankfully, older people can avail of breaks and deals midweek, for example, in this country, whether it be holidays. Airline travel has been pretty cheap and affordable in the last decade or so. Plan for your death. I'm not being morbid. It's something that we have to do. I was shocked when my solicitor, when I bought my first property, told me I had to make a will. You've got to do it once. And I think it can take away a lot of anxiety and uncertainty that you pass on to other people. If you don't make a will, the only person that wins is the tax man. And they're gaining enough, I think. Safety first. Have fun learning self-defense. That's what Janet Butwell says. I'm not sure about that one. Have a plan B. If you have a dream after retirement and it doesn't work out, I think it's a really good idea to have another option to fall back on, or maybe a modified version of your plan A. Give your home a facelift. It's amazing how we can forget about interior decor in our home. When we change furniture around, do a bit of painting, it can brighten up our surroundings hugely. Get professional advice on your pension. Build regular exercise into your lifestyle. There is an exercise circuit in most people's houses, and that is the garden, that is the stairs. Try and use them. If you're anxious about going out, if it's, too dark or too cold, even walking around the garden can be a good thing. Keep your personality intact. Choose community activities. Volunteering is a fantastic way of bringing meaning back into your life in terms of social activity. Use your hobbies to make new friends. Banish stress. Stimulate your brain. Try Sudoku. If you like things like that, will it improve your memory? The evidence on that is a bit mixed. You'll become a good Sudoku player, but whether or not it'll prevent dementia, I'm not so sure. Renegotiate your relationship with your children. Sometimes, it's really sad when I see older people and when we have consultations around, their children and how to access mental health services for their kids. I find it really sad sometimes. And when I hear that older people are paying mortgages or grandchildren's school fees because their children have really suffered in the recession, and that is happening more and more. And sometimes kids may have very unrealistic expectations of their parents because parental income does fall significantly after retirement. Reprioritise your key values. Include alternative therapies in your lifestyle. Revamp your wardrobe. Can be a very good thing to do for your mood. Spice up your leisure by setting yourself a challenge. Choose a target to aim for. Be prepared. Don't jump the gun. It may be that you need to downsize out of your 4-bedroom house, but if you do so too quickly and leave a community that you've lived in for decades, that may not be the wisest move. Try to walk as much as you can. Find a new way to describe your status. If you're an ex-teacher or an ex-doctor or an ex-whatever, what are you now after retirement? Are you a grandparent? What is your new role? How would you describe yourself in a social gathering? Keep a reflection diary. Try to sort out personal disputes if you can. Give it one last go. Make your savings work harder. And there are deals still out there. The banks sometimes still advertise better interest rates for senior citizens. Actively nurture your independence. Don't give up on that before you have to. Before downsizing, consider what local facilities you'll have if you move. Stretch your imagination and creativity. Doing something like creative writing, joining an art class can be a really, really useful thing to do and could put great meaning in life. Plant the kind of garden that works for you. I kid you not. The last thing you want to be doing is looking out on this expansive lawn that is a huge burden. So there may be ways of being able to cut down on the work that entails. Prioritise DIY jobs, but they should not be the sole focus of retirement. When I ask male patients when they retire what are they going to do, it's often the first thing that they say, well, I'll be doing a lot of the DIY jobs. But I think there's a lot more to retirement than that. Okay, I just want to talk a little bit about physical health in later life. The key principle of gerontology and medicine for the elderly is that illness is what causes all the problems in old age, and old age is not an illness. So I want to just touch on physical health because I think it's such an important part of aging well. Despite this, illness in old age is often seen as a social problem, when in fact illness is always due to a pathology that should be investigated, that must be managed and treated appropriately. It should not be dismissed as just old age. So what sort of things do you want to do in terms of health behaviours and habits to maintain good health in later life? Well, monitor a few basic parameters, your cholesterol level, blood pressure, glucose levels. We really should know these on the tip of our tongue. It's never too late to develop good eating habits, to cut down on some of the fried food or alcohol or whatever. Work your body, bring exercise into your daily routine. If it has to be 10 minutes to begin with once a day, so be it, and increase it very gradually if you can, and to the point of obviously not experiencing pain. Everything in moderation, alcohol, food, etc. Drink enough water. Effective healthcare is self-care. I suppose if you're to talk about two conditions that cause a lot of morbidity and problems for older people, it does boil down to two: high blood pressure and arthritis. High blood pressure causes a whole host of health problems in later life that are potentially avoidable and treatable. That really we should be aware of. And arthritis in the joints is obviously common as well. Make the most of high technology hearing aids. One thing to invest in if you do notice hearing loss is good quality hearing aids. Many conditions cause impairment of vision, but many such as cataracts and glaucoma are very treatable, and treating these problems helps maintain independence. Even if sensory problems appear untreatable, adaptations to the environment can overcome the worst aspects to them. Make the home slip-proof, particularly the bathroom. Slips and falls and trips are a really significant health problem for older people because they can result in fracture, and that can change an older person's life. So preventing these is the way to go. So we want to move towards the latter part of this evening's talk. We want to turn the 7 sins of aging. I couldn't care less. I can't be bothered anymore. I don't have the time. My mind is closed. I'm in denial. It's none of my business what goes on in the world anymore. My ambitions are no more. Into the 7 credits of aging. I can be bothered. I can still do it. I keep my mind active. I can create. I can make time. I deserve and get respect. I still have my ambitions. The golden rules of self-discipline would be: try and keep a structure to the day. Get up reasonably early to keep, I suppose, a brisk start the day schedule. Exercise in some way. Often exercise in the morning is best. Have something to do or look forward to each day. Try and fill your diary in the week with even 1, 2 or 3 tasks in the week. If you have an interest or a passion, don't let it become obsessive. Keep trying out new things. Keep a diary and a list of key projects and keep reviewing that list. Keep taking decisions. We don't want to let things drift. We want to maintain the life we want for as long as possible. Without giving up on independence before we must safeguard our ability to make decisions. There may be very important decisions that do come down the tracks in later life, and we want to be able to think them through in advance. Keep up healthy activity. Being active, embracing physical exercise and movement is very important. We do an exercise group on Vanessa Ward here in the hospital, and that is done in a sitting position on a chair. So even sitting in a chair, there's a lot of physical exercise that you can do. There's no need to climb mountains, though, if you don't like heights. You don't have to overdo it or be outrageous about the amount of exercise that you do. Build a routine that encourages self-esteem And as I say, doing something constructive daily is really important. Reward ourselves particularly with what we like doing most. If you think about our working career, a lot of work that we do is about things that we're not terribly skilled at. But in retirement, we should at least hone that down into things that are much more enjoyable that we would choose. So the million-dollar questions I think that we have to ask ourselves all about later life. What on earth are the next decades really going to offer us? What are our best hopes and worst fears for those decades? How much new life will we really manage to squeeze out of them? We used to be steered through our careers by our employers. Who on earth is going to help and advise us now? You know, we are paddling our own canoe. We need to put behind missed opportunities. There is little point, I believe, wasting time regretting the temptations we once resisted. Too much anecdotage living in the past is wasteful. It's the future and the present that matters. But we do have skills. We do have a repository of knowledge and information to bring with us on the journey. Bringing our old skills with us, it's time to better manage our health and welfare and establish a new identity and purpose. I think the young may even respect us for it. The triumph of longevity. I want to just conclude by reminding you that the history of humanity has been troubled and turbulent, and particularly in the 20th century, particularly in that century. Older people have seen world wars, racial strife, industrial upheaval, class warfare, economic recession. You know, older people have been very, very resilient, even through the most recent recession, because they have seen it before. In the 20th century, new terms have been added to our vocabulary, such as genocide, ethnic cleansing, global warming. You know, we've seen mass destruction on a horrific scale in the 20th century with the conflicts that we've had. I would argue that the one bright prospect and victory over that despair is that more and more people are living longer. We have added 30 years almost of life expectancy from 1900 to 2000. So we must make the most of that gift. Thank you very much for your attention.